It happens every summer. Someone slices into a cucumber from their garden, takes a bite, and immediately makes a face. It's bitter. Not neat salt bitter. Actually unpleasant, almost soapy, lingering at the back of the throat. Most people spit it out, shrug, and grab a different one from the bowl. End of story. Except in a small number of documented cases, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a hospital visit. That sounds absurd. A cucumber is about as threatening as produce gets. It's 96% water. It's the vegetable people eat specifically because it does almost nothing. And yet, buried in medical literature, there are real cases of people becoming seriously ill after eating a bitter cucumber. A few, involving extremely bitter squash relatives, have even been fatal. So what is actually going on inside a vegetable famous for being boring? The everyday explanation people reach for is that the bitterness is just a flavor quirk, some genetic accident, harmless if unpleasant. That's what most people assume. But that's not quite true. The bitterness is not a flaw in the cucumber. It's a weapon. And understanding why takes you somewhere you wouldn't expect, straight into a 4,000-year evolutionary arms race between plants and the animals that eat them. Cucumbers belong to a plant family called the Cucurbitaceae, which also includes squash, zucchini, pumpkins, and melons. Every member of this family carries the genetic instructions to produce a class of compounds called cucurbitacins. These are some of the most bitter substances known in nature, detectable by the human tongue at concentrations of a few parts per billion. For comparison, that's like being able to taste a single drop of the compound dissolved in an Olympic swimming pool. Why would a plant bother making something that intense? Because the plant isn't making it for you. It's making it for insects. Cucurbitacins are a defense system, and a remarkably effective one. In the wild cucurbits are under constant assault from beetles, aphids, and other insects that would happily eat the leaves, stems, and fruit down to nothing. Cucurbitacins deter almost all of them. They're bitter enough, and in higher doses toxic enough, that most insects take one bite and move on. It's a chemical fence, grown right into the plant's own tissue, and it's been running for millions of years. Here's where it gets stranger, though. Not every insect is repelled. There's a group of beetles, appropriately nicknamed cucumber beetles, that evolved to do the opposite. They're actually attracted to cucurbitacins. They seek them out, eat the most bitter parts of the plant on purpose, and then store the compound in their own bodies as protection against predators that might try to eat them. The plant built a fortress, and one insect turned it into a snack bar and a suit of armor at the same time. Evolution occasionally enjoys showing off like that. This chemical standoff is old, genuinely old. Cucurbitacins are thought to have evolved somewhere between 30 and 60 million years ago, long before humans existed to eat any of it. Wild cucurbits in Africa and the Americas grew so bitter that early humans who encountered them almost certainly avoided them entirely, the same way we avoid anything that tastes overwhelmingly unpleasant today. That instinctive rejection wasn't cultural. It was biological, hardwired, shared with countless other species that never bothered to develop taste buds sensitive enough to detect it in the first place. Which raises an odd question. If wild cucurbits were this bitter, how did humans ever end up eating them at all? The answer involves one of the oldest and least glamorous chapters of agriculture. Archaeologists believe cucurbits, particularly squash, were among the very first plants domesticated in the Americas as far back as 10,000 years ago, likely before beans or maize. Early farmers weren't necessarily selecting for taste at first. Some researchers argue the earliest domesticated squash may have been grown for their hard, durable shells, useful as containers rather than for the flesh inside, which would have still been intensely bitter and largely inedible. Sweetness, in a very real sense, came later. It was a side effect of thousands of years of humans quietly favoring the rare, less defended, milder tasting plants over their harsher wild relatives, generation after generation, without knowing anything about the chemistry behind it. In other words, the pleasant, crisp, watery cucumber sitting in a grocery store today is not the plant's natural state. It's the result of one of humanity's longest-running selective breeding projects, deliberately dialing down a defense system that took the plant tens of millions of years to build. But none of this explains why a cucumber in your kitchen would ever be dangerous to a human. After all, the cucumbers we actually grow and sell have been selectively bred for thousands of years specifically to get rid of that bitterness. Modern commercial cucumber varieties are bred to keep cucurbitacin production low, concentrated mostly in the stem end and skin, rather than spread evenly through the flesh. That's the plant humans intentionally re-engineered to be pleasant. So where does the danger come from? This is where the real twist shows up. Plants don't hold still genetically. Under stress, from heat, drought, poor soil, or even just unstable growing conditions, cucurbit plants can partially revert toward their wild chemistry. The genes for high cucurbitacin production are still sitting there in the plant's DNA, dormant but fully functional, like an old alarm system that was disconnected but never removed. Stress can flip it back on. So can cross-pollination with wild or ornamental gourds growing nearby, which can pass extremely high cucurbitacin genetics into an otherwise ordinary garden plant. That's why the danger isn't really about cucumbers as a category. It's about individual plants that, for one of these reasons, ended up producing cucurbitacin levels closer to their ancient defended ancestors than to the mild vegetable bred for supermarkets. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. When that happens, your own body reacts almost exactly like an insect's would. Cucurbitacins are cytotoxic, meaning they're capable of damaging cells directly, particularly in the lining of the digestive tract. In humans, eating a plant with dangerously elevated cucurbitacin levels can trigger a condition doctors call toxic squash syndrome. It causes severe abdominal cramping, vomiting, and profuse diarrhea, sometimes intense enough to cause dangerous fluid and electrolyte loss. In the most extreme documented cases, almost all involving extremely bitter zucchini or ornamental gourds rather than standard cucumbers, that fluid loss has been severe enough to be fatal, particularly in older adults or people who were already unwell. To put the potency in perspective, cucurbitacins are sometimes compared, gram for gram, to compounds found in certain medicinal and toxic plants used throughout history for their powerful biological effects. That's not a coincidence. The same intensity that makes a compound useful as a plant defense also tends to make it pharmacologically active in animals, which is part of why cucurbitacins have separately drawn interest from cancer researchers studying cell growth inhibition. The very quality that can make a rogue zucchini dangerous on a dinner plate is, in a different context and a controlled dose, the same quality that makes scientists want to study it more closely in a lab. There's also a strange irony sitting inside all of this. The plants most likely to cause trouble aren't usually the ones humans have been breeding carefully for generations. They're often homegrown squash and cucumbers, grown from saved seeds, sometimes unknowingly cross-pollinated with a wild gourd or an ornamental variety growing decoratively nearby. Ornamental gourds, the kind sold purely for autumn decoration, are almost never meant for eating precisely because their cucurbitacin levels can run extraordinarily high. When their pollen drifts into a backyard vegetable patch, the resulting seeds can carry that trait forward completely invisibly, with nothing about the plant's appearance giving any warning at all. So the headline isn't really about cucumbers being secretly lethal on a normal basis. It's about a warning system your tongue still carries from a time long before supermarkets existed. That intense, unmistakable bitterness isn't your taste buds malfunctioning. It's a message being relayed straight from the plant's own defense chemistry, largely unchanged since it first evolved to repel hungry beetles. Your disgust reflex and a cucumber beetle's feeding instinct are, in a strange way, running on the same underlying signal, just pointed in opposite directions. This is also why food safety guidance on the subject is so simple and so consistent. If a cucumber, zucchini, or squash tastes distinctly bitter or soapy, the advice is not to season it, cook it, or push through the flavor. It's to spit it out immediately and discard the rest of that plant's fruit, because cooking does not reliably break down cucurbitacins. The compound is heat stable. Boiling, frying, or grilling a bitter cucumber does essentially nothing to make it safer. Which brings the story back to that kitchen counter. Someone chewing, frowning, and setting the slice aside. It looks like nothing, a minor inconvenience, forgotten in seconds. But underneath that single bitter bite is a genuinely ancient signal. A molecule shaped by millions of years of plants trying to keep insects away, still fully wired into human taste perception, still occasionally showing up in modern gardens when a plant's old defenses flicker back on. The cucumber never became dangerous. It simply, in rare moments, remembered what it used to be.